This is the first time I'm doing this as an experiment. I hope it's going okay for you. I'm going to try to be a little bit more brief with miracles and give you more chance to do the work as well. So hopefully that'll be okay. Good. So with miracles, a good place to start is thinking of some examples. So you could think of a few examples of miracles. I don't really want in the exam for you to be sitting there thinking, oh, what was that miracle thing about as well, and trying to think of them there. Go into the exam armed with some examples that you're ready to use and ready to describe. So Jesus feeding the 5,000 with loaves and fish, the virgin birth, Moses and the parting of the Red Sea, the resurrection of Jesus, turning water into wine, Moses and the burning bush, 10 plagues, the Lord's medical miracles, and Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, curing a blind man, and the coincidence miracle, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute. So just some examples there. You don't need to remember all of them. You can use other ones. Those ones obviously from the Christian tradition. Feel free to use miracles from any faith that you'd like to. But maybe just 3 or 4 examples that you can discuss in the exam would be very helpful. Okay, so let's go through these definitions of miracles. The first one comes from David Hume. Now he sets this up in order to have a go at it. But David Hume defines a miracle like this. It's a transgression of the laws of nature brought about by God. It's also known as a violation concept of miracles. Okay, so this is perhaps what we usually think of miracles. It's something that breaks the law of nature, something that isn't in line with the usual laws of physics. So walking on water would be a really good example of that. If I try and walk on water, I'm going to sink, okay? Because the law of nature is you can't do that. Leaving aside clever questions about whether ice counts as water and things like that. But generally speaking, you can't walk on water. You sink. So when we read an account of Jesus walking on water, that's an account of a breach of a law of nature. It's brought about by God, and that's how Hume understands miracles. The second definition of miracle is also known as a coincidence miracle. This again is still thought to be brought about by God, but there's no breach of a law of nature here. Okay, so it's an event that's in accordance with the laws of nature, but which the believer sees as being due to the action of God. A famous example of the coincidence miracle is what happened to the choir. If you remember this choir example in Nebraska, isn't it? Yeah. So there was lots and lots of people. They were going to choir practice, and they practiced at the same time every week in a particular church hall. On this particular occasion, they were all delayed. They were delayed for all kinds of different reasons, so there wasn't a sort of shared reason why they couldn't get there on time. And so adding a little bit to the story, I'm afraid this is a bit of dramatic license from me, but you can imagine maybe one of them had a sick child, somebody else was delayed at work, somebody else had an aunt who just arrived and wanted to visit, somebody else, the bus was a bit delayed, somebody else's car wouldn't start. But for a whole range of different reasons, they couldn't get there on time. And on this particular occasion, just when they were due to be there was a big explosion in the church. So all of these people were saved. They were saved, obviously, their fate that would have happened if they'd been at the church when the explosion happened. There's no breach of a law of nature there, notice that. So people weren't driving in a car and then suddenly the car flew into the air to avoid the church or anything like that. Everything's in accordance with the law of nature. It's just a hugely unusual kind of experience. So this is what's known sometimes as a coincidence miracle. And obviously that gives you a clue as to what critics of this kind of miracle might say about them. Good. The third example is from the anti-realist view. This is by somebody called Gareth Moore. And this is that it's an inexplicable event which within the form of life of the believing community is termed a miracle. What Moore is arguing here is that we never discover that something's a miracle. We try to investigate, look at what other causes of a particular event there might be. And if there aren't any, then the believing community says, that's a miracle. But the key thing for Moore is this happens within a believing community. So miracle is a concept that makes sense from within a particular culture, within a particular form of life. So you may be reminded of the anti-realist challenge to religious experience that I was talking about a little while ago. Okay, so the anti-realist challenge to miracles again is really saying that these happen within a culture, within a form of life, within a community. When things can't be explained, the believing community term it as a miracle. The fourth definition of miracle is a little bit different. It comes from Sutherland and says that a miracle is a change for the better in a person. Okay? So the real miracle is when we let go of our selfish ways, when we let go of just being out for ourselves, when we start to think of others, when we move towards being more kind, loving and compassionate in how we are in the world, how we are in other people. I find this one really interesting because on one level this is a really poor definition. If you mean by a definition of miracle that you have to accurately describe the way the word is generally used, then this isn't really good. You ask most people in the street what do they think of miracle, they're more likely to go for Hume's definition. I don't think people are so likely to say, it's a kind of change for the better in a person. However, if you see Sutherland not so much as trying to describe the usage, but as trying to show what's really important, then maybe this is a really good definition of miracle. That miracles are really about what is most profoundly matters in our lives. One example I think I discussed with you in the summer is whether you'd prefer to levitate, literally. You'd float above the ground, 3 meters above the ground, but still have all your anxieties and fears and neuroses, the ones that we all have. I'm not thinking of anybody in particular, but we all have these kind of tendencies at times, these worries and fears. Whether we'd like to have all of that there, but be able to float above the ground, or whether it'd be more interesting to be grounded, to still be in touch with the earth, but somehow have a state of mind which was more free. So if we were to see the levitating person not so much as a literal description, but as an image of spiritual freedom, we might say, or religious freedom and inner freedom, then maybe that's what miracles are really pointing to. Certainly Sutherland would argue that. Okay? But again, of course, critics are going to say, well, that's all very well, but it's just simply not what the word means. The word means something like Hume describes, the transgression of a law of nature. Good. Okay, so the next thing to do is to look a little bit more at how Hume criticizes miracles. As you remember, he describes the miracle as a transgression of a law of nature brought about by God, and it's that conception of miracle that Hume is criticizing. Hume argues we should balance the improbability of miracles occurring with the evidence that they have occurred. He goes on to say that a wise person bases their beliefs on evidence. A miracle violates the laws of nature and is therefore an event that past human experience weighs heavily against. Okay, so if I were to tell you that, let's say, I'm going to visit family at Christmas, you'll believe me. At least I'd hope you'd believe me. One, because it's a very, very normal thing to do at Christmas time. Two, because, fingers crossed, you think I'm a relatively trustworthy person. Yeah. So you're balancing the probability of me lying or being mistaken, which is very low, against the probability of me telling the truth, being honest, and doing this ordinary thing, which is quite high. But if I were to tell you I'm going to go and see my family for Christmas and I'm going to fly there like Superman, then I imagine that you wouldn't believe me, because you're balancing two different things. On the one hand, Jake is a fairly honest, trustworthy kind of person, but on the other hand, how likely is it that he can breach a law of nature? How much evidence is there that human beings simply cannot fly like Superman? So this one, the evidence that we can't fly, is much heavier, so the balance tips. So this is what Hume asks us to think about when we hear stories of miracles, that the evidence that such things don't happen is so strong that they tend to outweigh the testimony of people who say these things have happened. Hume goes on to say something that in today's world may sound a little bit politically incorrect, to say the least. But he also says that miracle stories tend to come from what he describes as ignorant and barbarous nations. So whether we can dismiss that as Hume's Eurocentrism and his kind of outdated views, or whether there's something in what he says, is again something for us to think about and debate. But his basic point is, how often do you hear a description of miracles where there's a team of hundreds or thousands of respected scientists who all witnessed it personally and attest that this happened? Or are descriptions of miracles usually from less reliable sources? That's basically what Hume is trying to claim. The final criticism of Hume, again, is one that I mentioned earlier when we were discussing religious experience, is that the claims of different religions contradict each other. So the miracle stories from one religion appear to justify and prove that religion, but hold on, other religions have got an equal number of miracle stories, different kind of miracle stories, and they think those miracle stories justify their faith too. And if these faiths contradict each other, which they appear to on various points, then that leads to what Hume calls a complete triumph for the skeptic. The final thing in today's lesson is to talk about Maurice Wiles and his criticism of the idea of miracles. Now, Hume is an atheist philosopher. He doesn't believe in God. He's attacking miracles as part of a more general challenge to religious belief. Wiles is a little bit different. He's a Christian thinker. He's a theologian. So he's challenging the idea of miracles from a theological perspective, from the perspective of belief rather than the perspective of skepticism. And Wiles's point really comes down to this, that a God who intervened on occasional and seemingly arbitrary occasions wouldn't be worthy of worship. So a God who intervened to turn water into wine at a wedding, but didn't intervene to cure a young child with leukemia, say, is not a God worthy of worship. Yeah? A God who might, on occasions, cure some people, but didn't intervene in the Holocaust, didn't intervene to stop the Hiroshima bomb. This is a God not worthy of worship. So God's interventions appear to be, if we believe in miracles, Wiles says, arbitrary. So they're not clear when he's intervening, why he's intervening. They seem to be random. Or why doesn't he intervene more? So you can see here that Wiles' criticism of miracles is linked with the problem of evil. How can an all-good, all-powerful God allow there to be evil and suffering? And Wiles is arguing that really we should give up this idea of an interventionist God, a God who comes in and performs miracles on occasions, in occasional events, because such a God wouldn't be worthy of worship. That there's a moral problem with believing in that kind of interventionist God. Wiles's ideas themselves can be challenged. Ward, for instance, argues that the key purpose of miracles isn't primarily to relieve suffering, but the purpose of miracles is to promote faith. So it's not appropriate to look at the miracles that God is said to perform and say, can we judge those according to how much suffering they relieve? Ward is saying that the real purpose of miracles, the nature of miracles, is that they lead to faith. They promote faith rather than primarily aim to relieve suffering.